There may have been some of you, or I should say some of us, who came to church this morning a little bit down, not feeling as up and ready to do anything as we might have had some score been a little bit different yesterday. But if Sankara's solo didn't knock you out of that, there is nothing that can. Every time he sings, it gets better. Every time he sings, it gets better. Thank you, Sankara. Thank you, Bob, for making the arrangements. If you saw in my Messenger article this week that I suggested you consider reading one of the Passion narratives each day this week, and yes, they are long passages, but they're worth the reading. One of the things that I enjoy about doing that is noting the differences and the similarities between the different storytellers. As you know, anytime you have two or three people telling the same story, you're going to have two or three different stories. Some are going to put in some details that others are going to leave out. Some are going to come out with a conclusion that might be a hair different. And Luke is different from the other ones, from Matthew, Mark, and John, in that this Palm Sunday, this triumphal entry, if you will, with the cloaks and the palm waving, it never makes it to Jerusalem. It never makes it to Jerusalem. They get outside of Jerusalem some places. They're coming down that hill from the Mount of Olives between Bethany and Jerusalem, and Jesus is overwhelmed with the sight in front of him, and he begins to weep. He begins to weep over Jerusalem. It probably was not that the city, the people, hadn't seen the things that Jesus was doing. The problem was not that they hadn't heard his teaching. The problem was that the city of peace had failed to recognize things that make peace. They'd failed to recognize the things that make peace. The Pax Romana had become so ingrained that the city couldn't imagine peace in any other way. After more than 300 years of Greek and Roman military occupation, the people were used to it. They'd become somewhat complacent. I'm not all that certain that we have arrived at a similar state of complacency. Could it be that we're so surrounded by disappointment and discouragement that we don't recognize peace either? We see violence and we hear hatred, but do we recognize signs of peace? And it seems to me that the key word in this whole passage is recognized. Had they recognized signs of peace, had they recognized peace, things might have been different. It was right in front of their face, but they didn't recognize it. There is a difference between seeing and recognizing. To only see is superficial. We see an individual in an Italian suit and we're impressed by what we see. We see an individual in tattered clothes and covered with grime, and we see someone of little value or worth. But recognition moves beyond that superficial and looks at what's lying beneath. Recognition knows that the person inside that Italian suit is probably just wearing a costume and hiding, and that the person who's in tattered clothes and rhyme probably you're seeing what you're getting. They've been working. They've gotten dirty. It seems to me that when we only see something or someone, when we only see something or someone, we tend to not respond to what we are seeing. But when we recognize someone or something, our heart beats a little faster, and we are more apt to respond out of that recognition. I guess today I wonder if we're actually recognizing the signs of hate. They're around us too. The same kinds of signs of hate that were surrounding Jesus as he rode into Jerusalem. I'm certain that we see those hate-filled signs and we hear hateful words, but do we recognize what they really are? Or have we been beaten into complacency by years of gridlock and name-calling? I wonder, who weeps for us? Jesus wept over Jerusalem. But he didn't just weep over Jerusalem. He warned them of their impending disaster. Unlike the leaders of the city, Jesus was able to recognize the signs for what they really were. Jesus was able to look at the cooperation of the Jewish religious leaders and the Roman appointed political leaders and recognize that as a failed policy and practice, one which would lead to the end of their way of life. He could see the accommodations which had been made in the operation of the temple and recognize that it had become a place of corporate greed rather than a place of corporate prayer. And he recognized that it was already too late, and it broke his heart. If it was too late for Jerusalem, I wonder, do you think it's too late for us? Are there signs of peace that we're not recognizing? With today's state of affairs, it would be easy to hear the words that I've spoken and think that I'm only speaking of politics. I'm not. Peace is a much bigger issue than politics. Peace is much more personal than politics. The real question today, as I see it, is what is keeping us from recognizing the works of peace which God's Spirit is raising up all around us? What is keeping us from knowing peace in our own lives? Is it a matter of us not having peace? Or is it a matter of us not recognizing the peace which is already there? For about 3 years, Jesus had been delivering peace. He'd been healing the broken in spirit and body. He was changing the lives of almost everyone with whom he had personal contact. He was bringing water to the thirsty and food to the hungry. He was clothing the naked. He was snatching life from the grips of death. And thousands were experiencing this peace which was less political and more personal, peace which satisfied at a deeper level than any other peace imaginable. But still, there were some some who were unable to recognize the peace when they saw it. If being fed and clothed and watered and healed are sacraments of peace, then where do we recognize those signs around us in the world today? Or perhaps being fed and clothed and watered and healed are the results of peace. Perhaps Jesus' life of humility, compassion, and courage are the way of peace, the means for having peace. He could have ridden into Jerusalem as a conquering hero, sitting on a white stallion, but instead he rides in on a donkey. His focus could have been on his own success and acclaim, but instead he wept for Jerusalem, that city of peace, which was anything but peaceful on that Palm Sunday morning. He could have turned around and shaken his head and given up. But Jesus went to the temple and overturned the tables of avarice and oppression. This morning we're likely to think of Jesus strictly as King Jesus rather than humble Jesus. But the truth is, the road to peace does not run through a throne. It runs through the heart. Amen.